are joined by Maria Knake, Laboratory Assessment Program Manager. Thank you for being here today, Maria. Take it away.
Thank you, Kim. I'm so excited to be here with all of you today. Thank you to all of you for joining us. To get us started on our journey and our discussion today of standards as a second language, I'd like you to find a piece of paper and a pen or a pencil. Just take a second if you can locate that, and then I will get started with some instructions for you here. So once you've found your paper and your pencil, I'm going to give you just 60 seconds here. What I'd like you to do is go ahead and follow the instructions you see on the page using your paper and your pen or your pencil. So just take your time, follow those directions, and just see what you come up with. About 30 seconds to go, so hopefully you're about halfway done. "15 seconds. And your time is up. So how does your drawing look? Does it look like mine? My guess is that it probably doesn't. So what happened here? Well, probably a couple of things have occurred. First of all, I only gave you 60 seconds to read and complete 9 steps. Second of all, the instructions were not particularly clear. A lot of it was pretty vague. And you probably had to stop and reread them a couple of times and make some guesses to interpret what I had written along the way. So I imagine you didn't end up with something that looks like what I did. So why did I start our time off together with an exercise like this? Well, I wanted you to start thinking about how much potential there is for misunderstanding in a standard set of instructions and how important it is that the instructions are clear. Even more importantly, we all have to be interpreting the instructions the same way in order to achieve consistent results. And that's really what our discussion is going to be about today. It's about learning how to interpret standards that we use for laboratory testing to ensure we are all speaking the same language and getting consistent results. I would love to see the drawings that you've created today. If you are comfortable with us sharing your drawing on social media, please email it to me. Don't worry, I'm not going to give you credit for the drawing. It will remain anonymous. Nobody will have to know what sort of hot mess that you came up with on your piece of paper, just me. So please feel free to share that. I would love to see it and hopefully get a little bit of enjoyment out of seeing what your drawing looks like. So please send them my way. It's mknake@ashtoresource.org. As I was getting ready for this webinar today, I kept thinking about how much standards impact our daily lives. They're kind of invisible to us if you think about it, whether it's the light bulb in the room I'm sitting in right now, or the water I drank before I got started today, or the equipment we keep in our homes and our places of work that keep us safe. There are standards associated with all of the things that ensure that the light bulb will fit in and work when I screw it in, that the water I drink was safe for me to consume, that the safety equipment in my home will work properly when I need it to. And standards are just truly all around us. And it's really amazing when you think about it. In fact, the American National Standards Institute says that standards impact more than 80% of global commodity trade. That is massive. Standards drive our economy and they play a critical role in our infrastructure. And therefore, it's important that we know how to read and interpret these standards that play a role in our industry. Our learning objectives for today are as follows. First, we will locate the relevant information included on the title page and body of a standard. Secondly, we will recognize the differences between mandatory and non-mandatory information contained in the body of AASHTO and ASTM standards. And then finally, we'll discover methods of tracking standard changes and how to effectively implement them. These are 3 things that I see laboratories struggle with all the time. So hopefully our discussion today will help you improve in these areas, and you'll find this information useful. So just a little bit about me. First of all, I love standards. I am deep in this industry. Not only does my job, which is ensuring that laboratories comply with standards, involve reading and interpreting standards every day, I've got 14 years of standards development experience. Currently, I'm the vice chair of ASTM Committee D4, and I have other roles that I play in ASTM D4 as well. D4 is the Committee on Road and Paving Materials within ASTM International. I'm also the co-secretary of the Task Force on Asphalt Standards Harmonization, or TFASH. I'm not really going to be talking about TFASH today, but it is a group of people from both AASHTO and ASTM that have gotten together to try to harmonize the asphalt standards within our industry. If you want more information about TFASH, feel free to reach out to me separately. And then I'm also one of several staff liaisons to the AASHTO Committee on Materials and Pavements, and this is the group that writes the AASHTO standards that many of you use in your laboratories. So we're going to start out with a poll question here. And Kim's going to pop up this poll for us. Which standards do you use in your laboratory most frequently? So go ahead and you should see that poll pop up on your screen. Sometimes it takes a second for it to pop up, or it may be in a separate window at the bottom of your screen. So look for it if you don't see it. I'm seeing these results come in here. Okay. They're still populating a little bit. I'm going to wait just another second. And it looks like we have 17% using AASHTO, 25% using ASTM, and 38% are using a combination of both. Well, that is pretty amazing. So it seems like for most of you, it's AASHTO or ASTM or both, and that's excellent. That ASTM and AASHTO standards will really be the focus of our discussion today. I know some of you are using other methods and some state methods as well. But the great news is that if you know how to read either an AASHTO or an ASTM standard, they're written very similarly, and you will be a pro at interpreting both of them. All right, so moving on, just a little bit about consensus standards. Both ASTM International and AASHTO standards are consensus standards. There are 4 guiding principles that make them consensus standards. The first, of course, is consensus. Consensus means that substantial agreement has been reached by everyone who's involved in creating or writing the standard. Typically, it's more than just a simple majority, but it doesn't necessarily have to be unanimous, but it does mean that all of the views and objections have to be considered and an effort be made towards resolution in the standards development process. Openness is another guiding principle of consensus standards. Openness means that participation has to be open to anybody that would like to participate. This is where AASHTO is slightly different because AASHTO is a member-based organization and voting is restricted to the state highway departments who are the AASHTO members. So that is one area where AASHTO differs slightly. For ASTM, anybody can join ASTM, and also it doesn't require any sort of undue financial burden. For instance, joining ASTM is only $75. So it's a low cost and easy to get involved. Balance is also a critical component of consensus standards, and it means there has to be a balance of interest. The process can't be dominated by any sort of single category or party. In AASHTO, the way they do this is that each state gets 1 vote. For ASTM, there can be no more than 1 producer of a product or material voting in a subcommittee than there are all the other members combined, including users, consumers, and general interest. And that helps to maintain the balance and make sure that a certain producer of a product doesn't overpower the balance of interest in the committee. And the last important part of consensus standards is due process. Due process means that any person is free to express their position and rationale for their position on a standard. That position has to be considered, and there also has to be an appeal process for the outcome. ASTM and AASHTO AASHTO both outline their due process in their operating guides. So that information is available and for anyone that would like to see it. So we've got another poll question for you. Are you an active member of ASTM International? So go ahead, we've got a few seconds here to vote on this poll. Okay. So it almost seems like we've just got a couple people that aren't interested, but it's almost an even split between people who are, where there's other people in their industry who are members, and then there's some people who'd like to find out a little bit more about it, which is great because my next slide is about how to get involved in ASTM International. I highly recommend getting involved in ASTM if you're not already. In addition to having a voice in standards that are relevant to your field, it's also a great way to make industry connections and network with your peers. It's been really valuable to me for the 14 years that I've been involved. The membership fee, like I said before, it's just $75. It's really inexpensive. In addition to getting to vote on the standards, you also get an electronic volume of one of the standards. Each of these standards individually would cost hundreds of dollars, but you get an entire volume for just the $75 membership. It does allow you to vote electronically on ballots. You don't have to go to the meetings in order to participate. And it's very easy to get involved. You just go to astm.org, get involved, and then membership. I think Kim's going to be sharing some links with you later if she hasn't already. These are some of the committees that I recommend. These are some of the ones that are most common to the construction materials industry that you may find useful. I am a member of all of those committees. Most active in ASTM D4, but I'm a member of all of them. You can also get involved in the AASHTO Committee on Materials and Pavements. You have to be a state DOT to be a member of COMP, but you can be a friend. Anybody can be a friend of a technical section. It does require approval by the technical section chair, but it does allow you to comment on ballots as they come out. So you get to see every AASHTO ballot. It's great because you get to see the changes before they actually go into the printed version of the standard. And so you sort of have a leg up and know what's going on and what the changes are going to be before they actually come out. You can comment on those, and those comments are shared with the membership during the meeting, and they are considered. And you get to receive notifications about meetings that are coming up. If you have more information, I recommend that you contact Casey Sonera. She's the AASHTO staff manager for COMP, and she's your best bet for getting more information about becoming a friend of COMP. You can also attend the COMP meetings, whether or not you decide to be a friend or not. The meeting schedules can be found at materials.transportation.org. Our in-person meeting is typically held the first week in August. It's remote again this year, and to spread out the time and make sure that it's not just a one jam-packed week of being on web meetings all week. It's going to be the last week in July and the first week in August. And then we have online mid-year meetings that are held in the winter months, which are very easy for anybody to participate in. So we'd love to see more industry attend those events, and you're all welcome to join. Moving on a little bit to what these standards actually look like, how are they written, and how do we know what to put where in the standards? What's the anatomy of a standard? Well, both AASHTO and ASTM use ASTM's form and style. It's lovingly called the Blue Book because once upon a time when we still printed books, it was actually a physical blue book. But both AASHTO and ASTM refer to the ASTM form and style for how their standards are written. This describes which sections of the standards are required to be in the standard based on the standard type. The most common and the ones we'll spend a lot of time talking about today are specification. Test method will be where we spend a lot of our time specifically, and then also there's practices. So just a little bit more on each of those. A specification is a set of requirements that have to be satisfied for a material or product. For construction materials, specifications typically define limits from one or more test methods to define the minimum requirements of material in order to comply with that specification. You guys are probably all familiar with test methods. It's a procedure that produces a test result, right? It's a pretty simple one. And then practice. A practice, as I like to think of it, as a means to an end. It's a set of instructions, it's something that you do, but there's no test result. Typically, we use a specification for something like preparing a material for further testing. A good example is AASHTO R58 and ASTM 421. This is dry preparation of soil. We use this procedure to prepare the soil for a series of other tests that are performed. In AASHTO, it's very easy to tell whether you have a specification, a test method, or a practice because the first letter gives it away. M's are specifications, T for test method, R for practice. Within ASTM's form and style, there are several mandatory headings for test methods. I'm going to focus on test methods specifically, although form and style does address other types of standards as well, including specifications, guides, etc. But because the majority of you who are attending today are spending a lot of your time looking at test methods, we're going to cover that most deeply. These are the mandatory sections that are required to be in a test method. We're specifically going to focus on these 5: title, designation, scope, significance and use, and precision and bias for just a little bit today. We'll start with the title and spend quite a bit of time on that because there's a lot just to unfold with the title. But I wanted to mention that there are a whole slew of other sections that could potentially be in a standard as needed. And it could also be possible that a test method contains actually several test methods within a test method. And so you may see some of these sections repeated several times within a standard as well. Kim is going to share with you a link to a handout that we created for this session today. It's a handout that specifically provides you a little more guidance on what to expect out of the title and standard designation and what that information means in an AASHTO and ASTM standard. So go ahead and download that. That's for you to keep after our session today. I'm going to go through some of the information that's in it with you, but that might be a helpful guide to keep around, especially when you're trying to remember what all those little numbers and symbols mean. So let's take this example. This is an example for an ASTM standard. We'll go over an AASHTO example too after we finish this ASTM one. The good news is that AASHTO is a little simpler. So if you can figure out ASTM, chances are you'll be able to do the AASHTO version as well. So this is a very typical looking standard title that you might see on a title page for a standard. So we're going to go through this just a little bit at a time here. The first thing that you see is a letter. This is an alphabetical letter that represents the general classification of the standard. ASTM has several classifications, A through H, that you can see here on the screen. And this particular one is a D standard, which falls into miscellaneous materials. Asphalt and paving materials fall into this category, which is why most of the asphalt standards that you see are D standards. You'll see that for those of you that are involved with cement and concrete, most of those start with C. This is why they fall into cementitious, ceramic, concrete, and masonry materials. Within the construction materials arena, the standards that we usually see fall into A, C, D, or E. There could be times that you see some of the other categories as well, but these are going to be your most common ones. Next, you'll see this number. This is a reference number that's given to each standard. It's assigned in chronological order. In this example, this is the 3,744th standard approved in the D classification. So that's all that number means. It's just a way to uniquely identify it. The 11 is pretty simple. This is the year the standard was last revised. In our example here, this is 2011. And now this is where we get into some of the stuff that you may be wondering, well, what the heck is all of this? If you see a letter after the year, that indicates the standard was revised multiple times within that year. An A indicates that would be the second revision in 2011 in this case. A B would indicate that it's the third revision. During assessments, you should present a copy of the most current version of the standard. So if there's an A or a B version that year, that is the version that you would need to have. An epsilon superscript, now again, you won't always see this, but if you do see it, all it means is that there was an editorial change that did not change the year designation for the standard. An editorial change is something that's a very minor revision. that does not change the technical intent of the standard. It could be that they fixed a typo, or maybe some non-mandatory language in the standard was revised. And it's important to know that during assessments, AASHTO resource only looks for the revision date. Your version does not need to include the editorial revision. We don't care if there's a typo in your version or not. So it's okay if you don't have the epsilon version. After that, the date in parentheses here is the reapproval date. It can be confusing if you see two dates by the standard, and sometimes you wonder which one's the right one to use. This standard was last updated in 2011 in the example that we're looking at. This reapproval dates just means that the standard was reviewed and reapproved by the committee without technical revisions. Standards that are not revised and reapproved every 8 years are automatically withdrawn. So this is just useful information really for the standards developers so that they know how long it's been since they've last approved the standard. During assessments, we're only looking for that revision date. Your date does not need to indicate your version does not need to indicate the reapproval date. So if you just give us the 11A version during an assessment, we don't care whether yours has the parentheses with a 2016 on it or not. And then lastly, the actual title itself. The beginning of the title indicates which of the possible 6 standard types it is. In this case, we have a test method, but it could be one of the other 6 types that are listed below. And we've already gone over a couple of those more common ones together. And this takes us on to the AASHTO version. Like I said, if you can read the title page of an ASTM standard and interpret that, you're going to do just fine with AASHTO because it has a lot of the same stuff, but it's a little bit simpler. So in this case, the letter at the beginning of the standard does have a slightly different meaning. Rather than falling into a specific material type, this letter represents a different type of standard. So in this case, we have test method, specification, and practice, which I already mentioned to you, but I didn't mention that you could also see TP, MP, and PP, which are provisional test methods, provisional specifications, and provisional practices. A little bit about provisional standards. AASHTO publishes provisional standards when a standard really isn't ready for prime time, but publishing it will allow for wider use of the standard version so that the committee can continue to collect feedback and vet the standard before it becomes a full standard. You should know that AASHTO does not accredit for provisional standards. We wait for them to become full standards before we offer accreditation for them. Next, you see this number here, just like ASTM, this is a chronological number assigned based on the approval date. Again, this would be the 210th test method approved by AASHTO in this example. We've got the year again. This is again the same as the ASTM version. This is an important number to know. This is when the standard was last revised. You should know that AASHTO only makes technical revisions once a year. So you won't see the A, B, C sort of thing that you would with an ASTM standard with multiple revisions within a year. AASHTO is just once a year and then done. This is the reapproval date. Same for ASTM. And remember, during assessments, we're only looking for the revision date. We don't care about the approval date and whether or not that's on your copy of the standard. And then the title also gives you an indication of the type of standard, whether it's a test method, specification, or practice. A little repetitive, but you can get that information there as well if you forget what the letters mean. So one other thing about AASHTO standards that I wanted to mention to you quickly, and that's that there are 3 different types of standards that COMP as a committee manages. There are A standards, B standards, and C standards. A standards are standards that are solely developed, written, owned by AASHTO. B standards are ones that are jointly owned by AASHTO and ASTM. There is a memorandum of understanding between AASHTO and ASTM and an agreement that they jointly own several of the standards that are typically used by many of AASHTO Resources customers. And then there are C standards. These refer the reader from the AASHTO standard to the ASTM version. I'm going to show you examples of B and C standards, so bear with me for just a second. I'll explain a little bit more. So a B standard, just an example for you, and this is a real example, AASHTO T210, which is the standard test method for aggregate durability index. If you look at the AASHTO version of the standard, underneath it, you will see an ASTM designation. This is an indication that this is a jointly owned or B standard for AASHTO. It means that the AASHTO standard is similar to, but not identical to the ASTM standard. It's important to note that for accreditation purposes, if you wish to be accredited for both the AASHTO and the ASTM version of the standards, you must present copies of both the AASHTO and the ASTM standard during the assessment because they're not the same. So that can be a little confusing, and it's tripped up a few people sometimes because they see that as an ASTM designation written there. And a C standard, this is an example of a C standard. AASHTO T50 is a C standard, and it simply says in the document for the standard that AASHTO T50 is identical to ASTM D139, except as follows. And then it just lists a bunch of differences. Instead of this section, replace it with this, etc. I call these C for confusing. AASHTO has made a concerted effort over the years to reduce the number of C standards that are used, and they've either converted them over to A standards if the differences are numerous enough, or they've just gotten rid of the C standard altogether and just simply referred users to the ASTM version of the standard. But there are still a few that exist. A word of caution for you, this does happen. The AASHTO standard may refer to an older version of the ASTM standard. If the AASHTO standard refers to that older version and you're seeking accreditation for both the AASHTO and the ASTM version, you may actually have to present two different versions of the standard during the assessment. So make sure that you have both your AASHTO copies and your ASTM copies. If you are getting accredited for an AASHTO C standard, we need to see both the AASHTO standard and the ASTM standard. So moving on to the actual body of the standard, typically when you get into the body of the standard, the first section that you see is the scope. It's a very simple, short section. It's right after the title page. One of the most important items to pay attention to in the scope is the system of units used in the standard. This is a really critical part of the standard, and if you're not paying attention to the units that you're using, I urge you to go take a look at some of the standards in your lab, and I think you might be surprised about some of the unit statements that are in there. So here's an example for you. This is ASTM D 5084, and the scope statement of this standard says that values stated in SI units are to be regarded as standard. Then it goes on to say inch-pound units, which are provided for information purposes only, are not considered standard. So what this is telling you is this standard is listing both the inch-pound units and the SI units in the standard, but only the SI units are really part of the standard. The other ones are just for informational purposes. And you wouldn't know that necessarily if you didn't read the scope. So it's really important to see that. In this case, typically when this is done and there's just a conversion that's provided for informational purposes, this is what we would call a non-rationalized or direct conversion from the SI unit to the inch-pound unit in this case. Another example, this is a fairly simple example. This is AASHTO T300. This one simply says the value stated in SI units are to be regarded as standard. Easy peasy here, you only have one set of units to use, no problem. Another example, something else that you should be aware of, is something called combined standards. In this case, this is the penetration test, ASTM D5 for asphalt binder. It's actually D5/ASTM D5M. And what the scope says is that the value stated in either SI units or inch-pound units are to be regarded separately as standard. So this is an interesting case. A couple of things to be aware of with this. Each system of units is independent of the other. This is actually two standards within one. Typically, you can't combine the values from these two standards because it could result in nonconformance with either D5 or D5M. It's important to know if you're a specifier or if you're working with somebody who's specifying one of these combined standards that you know whether they want you to use the SI or the inch-pound version of it. Should also be aware that they typically contain rationalized conversions. Rationalized conversions are a simplification of the converted value to something that's more realistic to reflect real measurements or configurations. A simple example, a direct conversion of 6 inches is 152 millimeters, but a combined standard may use 6 inches in the inch-pound version of the standard and then 150 millimeters in the SI version of the standard, because that may be the way the apparatus is actually manufactured for the two different versions of the standard. That's what's actually being produced, but they're not the same, so you can't use that equipment interchangeably in that case. So something important to look out for. This occurs in both AASHTO and ASTM. It's not specific to one standards development body or the other. You'll see instances of this in both cases. My favorite section of the standard is the significance and use section. Bear with me and I will explain why. At AASHTO resource, we used to require that all new laboratory assessors read every standard in our assessment scope. Seriously, it was like 300 pages. We would just plop it in front of them, this big stack of books, and say, get reading. Well, over time, we realized that that was probably just a really big waste of time and resources, and that our trainees weren't getting a lot out of that process. Now we put our staff through training similar to what you're going through, and we teach them how to read a standard. And one of the first things we teach them is to really focus on the significance and use. The significance and use is the why behind the standard. If you understand the why and the significance behind each step in the procedure and why it's done, it makes way more sense, and it's much easier to follow and comply with the procedure. It's a great training tool, so start using that significance and use as part of your training program if you haven't already. Typically, a section that would be towards the very end of the standard is precision and bias. So precision is the closest of agreement between test results. A lot of times we ignore this part of the standard, but it is pretty critical. One of the reasons it's really important is because it can be used to assess how valuable a test procedure is, or really how good is it. If the results aren't repeatable, then it's probably not a very great test method. Something's wrong. So it can be a great indication for us. And both AASHTO and ASTM standards test methods are required to have precision and bias statements. In terms of precision, there's two things that you'll see. The first is within laboratory variability, also called repeatability. And this is if the same technician used the same equipment several times to test the same material, how close would their results be? Or how close could you expect their results to be? This could also be used as a tool in your own laboratory. If you have a technician who's running the test and your results are all over the place, it could be used as a way to troubleshoot and really look at the effectiveness of your equipment, make sure that maybe you don't have a fan blowing on your balance or something like that. So it could be the start of a root cause analysis for you. And then also between laboratory variability is part of the precision statement. We also call it reproducibility. And this shows us, statistically speaking, how close we can expect two different technicians in different laboratories using different equipment, how close their results should be if they're testing the same material. That's, again, reproducibility, and can be really important if you're looking at quality control data and trying to determine the validity of the data that you're getting. Now, in terms of bias, what it is, it's the error that's inherent in a test method when compared to a known reference value. You have to have a known intrinsic property of a material in order to define bias. As an example, a known intrinsic property that a lot of us are aware about is the freezing point of water, which we know to be 0 degrees Celsius. In most construction material standards, we don't have a bias statement because there's just no reference value. So typically you won't see that very often. It's good to know what it is, but you probably won't run into it very often. All right, moving on. I've got a little case study here for you guys. So what I'm going to ask you to do is read this excerpt. It's a fake standard that I made up, but read this excerpt of a fake standard and think about, as you read it, how you would interpret and perform the steps listed. And I'm just going to give you 60 seconds to go ahead and read, and go ahead and write down your own thoughts and ideas about how you would interpret the steps that are listed here. Thirty seconds to go. All right, hopefully you got a chance to read through that and you have some thoughts. I've got a couple of questions that I'm going to ask you. So my first question here, an AASHTO resource assessor observes that the technician does not add any dispersing agent to the sample prior to agitation. Is this a finding? What do you guys think? Well, the answer in this case is no. The reason is that the word should is non-mandatory language. The sentence says a small amount of dispersing agent should be added to the sample. The word should really means that we recommend you do it, but it's not required that you do it. It's not preferable when writing a standard to use non-mandatory language in the body of the standard, but it happens, and it's important to know how to interpret it when you come across it. Another question for you. An AASHTO resource assessor observes that the sample contains particles smaller than the number 200 sieve, but the sample was not allowed to sit for 15 minutes prior to agitation. Is this a finding? What do you guys think? Again, the answer is no. Notes contain non-mandatory information. Even though mandatory language, the word shall, is used in this step, it's still not required. Again, it's not preferable to use mandatory language in a non-mandatory portion of the standard, but it happens. So be aware of how to interpret those. Just kind of a quick summary of mandatory versus non-mandatory language. Words like shall not, must, that is mandatory. Non-mandatory, should means it's recommended that you do it, but it's not required. May or can, those are optional steps. They're not necessarily recommended or not. You can do them if you want. And then we also have portions of the standard that are mandatory versus non-mandatory. First, this is confusing for a lot of people. Footnotes that are in tables, a little note that's at the bottom of a table in a standard, is mandatory language. It's confusing because notes, as I just went over with you guys, are non-mandatory. Footnotes are. An annex contains mandatory information. An appendix is non-mandatory. They're both usually included at the very end of the standard. One's required, one isn't, so it's important to know the difference there. Usually there's clear language that says non-mandatory or mandatory as well, so that's useful, but it's also good to know. Typically, in terms of what's mandatory in the body of the standard, any language that's in the body of the standard except where non-mandatory language is used. So if any of these words should, may, can are used, then it's not mandatory. Otherwise it is. Sometimes there are portions of a standard, especially in the apparatus, or there could be optional steps as well. So if it's listed as optional, then it's not required either, it's optional. One more poll question for you guys. Where do you purchase standards for your laboratory? I'll give you just a few seconds here. See what sort of results we get. Okay. And it looks like a lot of folks are using ASTM Compass. That's great. We've got 60% using ASTM Compass. You can get both AASHTO and ASTM standards from ASTM Compass, in case you weren't aware. We've got around 5% getting from the AASHTO bookstore, ASTM Compass and the AASHTO bookstore. So we have a few people that are using both. We've got a few other sources as well. TechStreet and IHS are other providers of standards that you can purchase subscriptions to. And some of you don't know or are using some other way to get your standards as well. Very interesting. A lot of you are using ASTM Compass. That's great. So we're going to talk a little bit about tracking changes to standards. One of the things that I see a lot of laboratories struggle with is tracking changes to the standards that they use. In fact, many of the times when we write findings during demonstration of a test procedure as part of an assessment, it's because there was a change to the method and the laboratory didn't know about it. Staying apprised of changes to standards is important for a number of reasons. First, it helps ensure compliance, which is just incredibly important in our industry, consistency. It helps you keep up with changes in technology, can help you avoid findings during your assessment, of course. You can avoid disputes, and most importantly, ensures continued validity of your test results and gives you confidence that you're running the procedure the correct way. A couple of free tracking tools that you should know about. First is ASTM Standards Tracker. This is an awesome tool. You can sign up to receive notifications from ASTM International for only the standards that you are interested in, and you'll be alerted every time one of them is updated. ASTM typically, they update standards a couple of times a year. It's usually less. It could be up to a couple of times a year. For AASHTO, those standards are updated all at once, so it's a little easier to track. AASHTO has a publication newsletter that you can sign up for, and I believe Kim is sharing some links for both of these with you, so you can sign up for the tracker and AASHTO's publication newsletter. AASHTO just typically updates their standards once a year. Late July is the time period to look for those updates to come out. But the newsletter is a great way to be informed, and that way you know just as soon as they're out there and you can start making plans for implementation. Just a couple of other recommendations. I really recommend having your own spreadsheet for tracking the standards within your scope of work. A lot of times you may have a contract for a project that started before a new version of a standard came out, and you are obligated to continue performing that test the old way, but you may have a new contract where you're running the test method to the most current version. So it's important to keep track of which versions you're using for which projects and which versions are the most current. Also, you may be using some state published standards. I recommend that you check to see if there's some sort of email list or communication you can opt into to keep track of those as well. So, you know that there's a change to the standard. The next big hurdle is knowing what changed. There's a couple of easy ways to do that. For ASTM, ASTM Compass, one of their subscription options allows you to include red lines. I love this. It's so easy. You can just go to that red line. You can see exactly what was stricken out in the standard, exactly what was added. It's in a different color text, and it's either underlined or struck through. So it's very easy to determine what exactly changed from version to version. For AASHTO, there is a revision list for AASHTO standards available for free from AASHTO's bookstore. If you go to the AASHTO bookstore website and find the material standards, scroll to the bottom of the page, and you will see some of the free downloads that they have there. If you're having trouble finding it, you can't locate it, shoot me an email and I'd be happy to send it your way. So now you know what's changed. The last and most important step is you actually have to implement those changes. And this is a mistake that we see a lot of laboratories make as well. It can be very difficult to figure out how to communicate this information effectively. So I really highly recommend that you develop a procedure for communicating changes to your impacted personnel, especially your laboratory staff, the people that will be using these standards the most. Also, make sure that you have some sort of method in place to ensure that staff always have access to the most current versions. So think about how you're doing that and how you're tracking that information. Also, this is something we do at AASHTO Resource for the Laboratory Assessment Program. We actually have a change management interval. We update the checklist that our assessors use in the field 4 times a year. So we go through, we look for all those changes that are going to go out for that quarter, and then we release that new set to staff. There's less confusion that way. We're not dealing with a new standard every day and wondering what was updated and what wasn't. We know it's once every quarter, so it's very simple for us. It does mean that occasionally a standard will get updated and then it won't be in our current version, but we will catch it next time very quickly. And usually we're not that far behind. Find some way to reduce the risk of outdated versions. We still have some print books that we use in our office, and we make sure we mark them with an out-of-date sticker or a reference-only sticker so that we know that. But having some way to manage that where people are going to a central location rather than saving copies on their desktop or something like that can also help reduce that risk. And then make sure you're getting input from the staff that are using these standards every day. They're the ones who need to get to that material and use it while they're performing tests. So first of all, make sure they have access to it. Life is open book, right? Make sure that they have all these standards available that they need to do their job, but get their input on what's going to be best in terms of a format and method for them to get those standards, and also to make sure that they're aware of the changes. Just a couple of resources for you guys before we wrap up, and Kim's going to send you some links for these as well in the chat. First of all, we have an article on our website called Raising Your Standards, and this goes a little bit further in depth on methods for tracking and implementing changes to test methods. There's also some ASTM member training, which goes over a lot of the details on standards development that we didn't get to today, and goes into a lot of great detail on ASTM's processes. Even if you're already a member of ASTM, if you've never done any of that training, I really recommend it. If you're thinking about getting involved, this is a great place to start. And then also I've included some links to ASTM, the American National Standards Institute, or ANSI. They've got a great website that has a lot of educational materials about standards in general. So I've got those for you as well. Back to our learning objectives. After this webinar is complete, you're going to be asked to complete a feedback survey. We really do appreciate that feedback. We use it in improving the materials that we offer to all of you. So please make sure that you fill it out and take a look at our learning objectives and make sure that we actually met them for you today. And please rate me on how well I was able to help you achieve those learning objectives. And with that, I believe it is time for Q&A. Kim, do we have any good questions?
We do have some questions.
Right.
So let me get situated here. So our first question is, why is M for specification and R for practice? Why isn't an S for specification and P for practice?
That is a great question. I wish I knew the answer to it. I'm not exactly sure. I'm sure there's some history there, but it predates my involvement, and I'll have to ask. I'll have to ask around and see if I can figure that one out. Great question.
And if anyone else has questions or something to spark, be sure to type them into the Q&A feature there. But I did have a question. Did you talk a little bit more about the TFASH?
Oh, sure. Yes, this is the Task Force on Asphalt Standards Harmonization. And we have a charter that we co-created. There are official voting members that come from AASHTO and official voting members from ASTM. We meet regularly every couple of months. Everything is online. So if you're interested in getting involved, let us know. We also accept friends. So anyone who'd like to be a friend of TFASH, just shoot me an email and you'll get on the mailing list. You'll know when all of our meetings are going to be. But we meet every couple of months, and we're just slowly trying to work together and collaborate and go through all of the asphalt standards, in which there is both an AASHTO version and an ASTM version, and see if we can come to some agreement on the differences, and then hopefully put forth ballots on both sides. Got a little tongue-tied. I get excited about TFASH.
You
do. To help create that agreement, and the people that are involved are really passionate about it. And I'm a non-voting member. I'm the secretary. Me and Joe Williams, who's also a member of our AASHTO staff, are the co-secretaries. And the reason we feel so passionate about it is because it's good for industry. It creates less confusion. It's it's really good for everybody in the end if we can make these standards as similar as possible.
All right, we have another question in. Can you explain the difference of units for the D5, D5M example again?
Sure, I can try to do that. So in this example, the D version of the standard is going to be your inch-pound units. So it's going to work. English is what we would usually say, English units. ASTM uses the language inch-pound. The M version of it is going to be your metric or SI version. They're both separate standards within one, which is a confusing thing. But essentially you would specify that you would want either one run or the other. If it's D5, then you're specifying the inch-pound version. If it's D5M, you're specifying the SI version. M means metric, although they use SI in the actual standard itself. It's sort of a holdover. But it's important to know which version that you are running. And because the units are not direct conversions of each other, the standards are actually completely different, and you can't combine units, or you may end up with something that's entirely different than either one of those standards.
Yeah, does that happen often where there's the English and the metric version in the same thing?
Yeah, it's pretty often that it happens. There's quite a few examples within both AASHTO and ASTM.
I hadn't noticed, but I'm not living in the standards world that you live in. So that was just my question, if that happens very often.
A lot of people see it, but they just don't know what it is. So I wanted to make sure that we touched on that. It's an important little tidbit.
Somebody wants to know, is AASHTO accreditation for the United States only?
We do have some laboratories that are outside of the United States. Right now, all of our assessments are happening remotely. However, once we are getting back out on the road, which I do hope will be very soon, any of the laboratories that gained their initial accreditation from us remotely will have to have an on-site assessment, and there are travel costs involved. Depending upon where internationally you're located, those can be costly. So we don't have a ton of international involvement, but we do have a few international participants, and certainly we welcome that. The only other caveat is it has to be a place that is determined safe for us to travel to. So we do follow the State Department recommendations from the United States regarding places that are safe to travel.
If you have more questions about that specifically, you can email info@ashtoresource.org or email Maria or me, and we can get you more details on that. Another question that we get often that no one has asked yet, which I'm surprised, is how can somebody recommend a change to a standard?
Oh,
so they see something,
question.
they see something, they're like, this, I don't think this is right. How can someone recommend a change to that?
So typically for ASTM, you can go to their website and you figure out what committee the standard belongs to. And then once you figure out the committee, email the staff person at ASTM that's in charge of that committee, and they will get it to the right person. And they're very good about that. As somebody who is the chair of an ASTM committee, I get those emails all the time, and we always consider them and put them in our agenda so they do get to the right place. If it is an AASHTO comment, then you can either just email it right to me, or you can send it to Casey Sonera, whose email address I gave earlier in this presentation, and maybe I can type it into chat as well for you guys.
And I think we have a spot for that in ashtoresource.org/feedback. I believe there's a link there for recommending how to make changes. So another question that just came in is how ASTM separate volumes. Why are they include some with others or not? So how come ASTM comes in separate volumes? Starting with C and things like that.
That's a good question. I don't know if I can fully answer it, but my understanding is that it's based on material type. So they have a volume that's on soil and rock, one that's on paving materials. They have one that's on iron and steel products. Now they don't print things anymore, but when they did, they were an actual physical volume, and you couldn't put them all in one book. And so they've kind of kept that historical designation of the volumes.
Thank you for that clarification. Anybody else have any other questions before we wrap it up? No, and I did want to put out there that when we were talking about where you're getting your standards from, that AASHTO, if you get your standards from the AASHTO bookstore and you're an AASHTO accredited laboratory, you do get a discount for that. So AASHTO accredited laboratories are emailed the discount code. If you did not get that email, you can actually email me directly at kswanson@ashtoresource.org. And we do make that available for AASHTO accredited laboratories only. So wanted to throw that out there as that. So see, no more questions come in. I want to thank you, Maria, again. If you have any questions for Maria about this topic, feel free to reach out to her directly. And again, as Maria mentioned, when you exit the webinar, you're going to be directed to a feedback survey, and please take time to fill that out because we do take your feedback seriously. And I want to thank everybody here for attending today's webinar. I hope to see you at future events. And if you are looking for other ways to connect with AASHTO Resource, you can find us on Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, and now on most podcast services with our podcast, AASHTO Resource Q&A. And we're currently planning our next free webinar for August of this year, and you'll find more details about that on our events page. So thank you, everybody, and have a great day.